Hi, I'm Robert Joseph, and today I'm going to teach you how to make this tank top dress. So there are two different lengths here. So this is actually the full size pattern, and what I've done here with this one is I've shrunk the regular size pattern down to half size, and that's so that I could get all the pattern pieces in the video frame. Now this one here looks much longer, and let me just pull this up so you can see the end of my half size dress form here. It's basically about the upper thigh. So this is actually a full length for the full size pattern, and it actually sits about the top of the calf, whereas this is the actual regular size pattern, and it sits actually right on top of the upper thigh. So if you're thinking about lengths, you may want to take that into account. Now basically these two are virtually the same. The sewing construction is exactly the same. On this one here, I took the liberty of using my cover stitch machine around the neckline and the hem area, whereas in the video I actually use a zigzag stitch for around the neckline and armhole and also on the hem, and I walk you through that procedure. Now there is a little bit of difference here between the binding here and the binding here, and as I was making this I realized that my binding for the armhole and the neckline was actually too wide. So your pattern has been corrected to reflect the width of this binding here, and the finished width should be about a ½ inch. A couple of things about these videos before we begin. So this is a really long video, and there are chapter markers below for you to skip ahead. But I will warn you that if you do skip ahead, you may be missing valuable information along the way. So I know that I do get kind of long-winded and wordy sometimes, but I'm really trying to give you the most information I can to actually help you to make your garments come out as best that you can. Another thing is that I don't really do voiceovers. I'm actually narrating as I'm sewing and making the garment. So sometimes I stumble and use the wrong word and then correct myself, and I don't really go back and correct those because I actually correct myself as I'm going along, and it actually makes the editing of these videos a little bit easier and quicker. So I just prefer narrating the video, so that way you get kind of the feeling about how I work, and if you were actually taking a class with me, what it would be like, and I'm hoping that I don't scare you. One last thing is that I don't put background music in my videos anymore. I was having too many problems with people claiming the copyright on the music that I was making for my own videos. So all I can suggest is to put some music on in the background. So now enough with all of the boring little housekeeping things. Let's get to actually making your garment. Okay, I'm about ready to lay out the fabric and cut it, but I just want to remind you that I am working with half-size patterns, and I'm just doing that so that I can fit everything inside the frame of the camera. You, of course, have full-size patterns. So a couple things with that: the notches, seam allowances, and hems are all the same amounts as your patterns, so that my sewing will be exactly the same as the way that you would sew it. My patterns are just half size. Additionally, there is one marking on your pattern for a dotted line, and that's to actually a good spot for you to shorten it. That would be about your knee length. This full length is going to be approximately about a T length, so it would hit about mid-calf or just below that. So I'm going to get the fabric laid out. My fabric also, I have cut it down half size. So I'm only working with half of the full width of the fabric, just so that you can see that I actually truly am working on half size models here. So one other note is, even though that your fabric requirements on your pattern list the tank dress to be cut out of all the same fabric, I'm going to choose to do the neckline and the armhole out of a contrast fabric, and that's just so that you can see where those pieces go. So I'm going to get ready to start now. I'm going to actually leave the contrast over to the side for right now, and I'm going to get my fabric laid out. Now this is the part where I usually speed up the video. Before I do that, I just want to let you know that I like to fold the fabric because these two pieces need to be cut out on the fold. I like to fold and then cut, and then fold again and then cut again. And some pattern companies like to fold both of your selvages or your side edges into the center and then cut each pattern out that way. When you do that, sometimes I feel like there is more wasted fabric, so I choose not to do that. So I'm just going to fold over the needed width that I need for my first pattern piece that I want to cut. And which one is that going to be? I'm going to cut the back out first. Okay, so now that everything is cut out, we're actually going to start by joining the front and back at the shoulder seams. So we can actually just set aside these armbands and neckband. And then I'm going to actually just take the pattern away. And you can hang these. If you punch a hole, then you can hang it on a pattern hook or fold it up neatly. So let's go ahead and get this all joined up together. I'm actually going to, let me lay out the back. Where I'm going to lay this out with the face side up. I like to say face side instead of right side, because sometimes you might, we have a right and a left side of the garment as well, so that's why I say face side. This is the face side of the fabric. And then I'll open up the front of the tank dress, and I've got the face side here, so I'm going to match the face side to the face side of the front to the face side of the back. Up here at the shoulders, match these seams. And the way that I like to do it, there is going to be a little bit of overage up here because that's seam allowance. So what I like to do is I like to match the armhole edges up here and then walk that angle up. And I'm using a jersey cotton with some spandex in it, so it sticks together on its own pretty well. So, and then I'm just going to go ahead and pin this. And then I'll do that to the other side. So the armhole cut edges should match very cleanly. And then I'm going to put a pin here. And now both of our shoulder seams will be pinned. I'm going to use the overlock and just stitch these together. Okay, so just really quickly, I don't usually talk during the sewing parts, but just really quickly, a couple of things. I like to sew from the neckline to the armhole, and that's so we don't get any weird stretching happening. So everything will stay nicely in place here at the neckline. And so that means on this other side, I'm going to have to flip it over to sew from the neckline here, but on this one I'm all lined up to sew from the neckline to the armhole. The other thing to remember is I like to push my fabric all the way up to close to the needles, and that ensures that I'm going to get a good even pull right at the beginning of the seam. My tongue isn't working. Okay, so the reason I do that is because if I start here without putting it here, I kind of have to push the fabric in to get the feed dog here to grab the fabric. And sometimes when you're pushing it to get it to feed, you get a bunchiness up here, and sometimes the fabric will not catch right. So the other thing is I'm lining my edges up with the knife. This is the knife right here. And I'm not really meaning to cut anything off because the seam allowances are 1/4 inch. And so I'm not really planning on cutting anything off, but if you see a little coming off, it'll be okay. It's not going to be a big deal. So again, just to reiterate, I'm sewing from the neckline to the armhole, and I'm going to push my fabric up all the way to the needles to start. Okay, so one other thing that I just noticed, this is a teachable moment. Here on the first shoulder that I sewed, on the opposite side here, it looks a little loose. And the reason for that is because I didn't check my tensions before I started. So I didn't run a test piece of fabric through. So I have good tension here on both sides of this one because I noticed that my tension was off on the first one. So I'm just going to run that back through really quick. The other thing is, as I'm not really clipping too close, I clip this one of the threads off because I don't want them to unravel before I actually get the actual neckline binding and the armhole binding. So that's just one of the things that I like to do. I like to keep a little bit longer threads here on either side, and then they'll be cut off when I put the neckline binding and armhole binding on. Okay, so I have the shoulder seams all sewn, and this is the side I had to re-sew because I didn't check the tension before I started. So this is good when I have the extra thread there. That'll be cut off when I do the neckline binding. So I'm just gonna like move this down a little bit because I'm gonna actually get my neckline binding. We're gonna prepare that. So this is the neckline binding piece, and what we're first gonna do is we're gonna find the face side, and we're just gonna fold it in half short ways to this edge, and we're actually just going to sew this seam down here to close it off. So I'll put a pin there. Now you could sew this seam with your straight stitch, and a lot of companies do that. I don't want to switch over to my sewing machine, so I'm actually just going to overlock this. It'll make it a little bit easier. However, I will say that on some finer fabrics, you may want to use a straight stitch, press the seam open. So you would press the seam open, and then we would fold it in half lengthwise. And what that does is it actually reduces the bulk. But since this is a quick and easy tank top, I'm just going to overlock this edge really quick. Okay, so now we have the neckband all sewn together, and what we're going to do is just go ahead and press the seam to one side, and then you're going to fold the neckband in half to match the cut edges, and that will make it a little bit narrower, more narrow. And you can finger press this if you would like. You could use an iron and press it, but I want to warn you that if your knit has a synthetic in it, like polyester, nylon, elastane, or spandex, be careful that you're not pressing it too hard and long. You may melt the fabric, or it may even cause shine that you can't get out. So use a press cloth if you choose to press it. Now I'm actually going to use some pins. I want to keep this together all the way around, so I'm going to put a pin here at each one of these notches. Now I've made it a little bit easier for you because I have I haven't evenly spaced them, but the notches are spaced out according to the amount of stretch that the area around the neckline needs. So all we're going to need to do on the garment is actually find the center front and the center back. Okay, I've got my pins there. Let's set this aside for right now. So all we need to do to the garment is I'm going to actually match, kind of fold this, again, face sides together, and I'm going to match up these shoulder seams real quick, and I'm going to find the center back and the center front. And we could have done this, you could do this when you cut the fabric out if you want, just put maybe a chalk mark there, so you don't have to do this part. But we just need to find the center front and the center back of the garment at the neckline. Try not to stretch as you go. All right, so there's my center front. Okay, so those are all the marks that we need. Let me actually lay this out so you can see it better. Okay, so this is the center front, this is the center back, and of course we have our two shoulder seams. So I've got my neckband, and I'm gonna, this seam in the neckband, we're gonna mark to the center back. And right across from that is the center front notch. So basically we're going to match that seam and then this notch here to the center front. And then these other two notches we will actually match to the shoulder seams. So I'm going to get that lined up, and of course this will be face side to face side on the outside of the garment. So I've got that seam marked here, and I'm just going to use the pins that I had in the neckband. And then I'm actually just going to walk this around. Don't worry about stretching it for right now. I'm going to take this notch, the next notch, and I'm going to match it to the shoulder seam. And I'm going to push that shoulder seam toward the back. And I'll just match that notch up there right on that seam, use this pin, and repin it there together. And then just carefully walk around the rest of the neckline to match up the notches on the neckband. Here I am at the center front. And remember, you will need to keep your edges together, but of course these notches come out away from the cut edge, so we'll be cutting those off as we sew. And then we can actually readjust while we're in the machine as well. And then I'm coming up here to the other shoulder seam. I'm going to make sure that I'm pressing that seam toward the back, and I'm going to match my notch up to that seam, and then I'll just pin it in place. Okay, so now I've got it all pinned, and remember this I'm just going to cut off, or I could cut it off now, but I'm going to cut that off while I sew. So let me see, how am I going to sew this? I think I'm going to want to sew it this way, so I'm going to actually turn it so that I'm sewing it this way in the machine. So I have this on the top, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to be stretching the neckband to fit into the garment neck area here. You see that in the light. So I'll just be stretching that neckband and making sure all of the edges are matching, and of course that I keep the shoulder seams pressed toward the back. And I'm going to start right here just before the center seam. I'm going to start at an angle, kind of feed that into the machine, and then of course I'll be removing the pins as I go. Okay, so to get started here, I'm actually just going to remove the center back pin, and it's still pinned to the garment with the binding, the neck binding. And so what you're going to be doing is you're going to be stretching the neck binding to fit into the neck area while you're keeping all of your edges close together. And because I'm working on a half size, there isn't a whole lot of stretch here. Try not to stretch the garment itself too much. It's okay if you stretch it a little, but if you stretch too much, your binding, your neck area will come out a little bit wavy. So to get this in here, lift the presser foot up. I'm going to come in here at an angle. And of course, remember that you have the knife here. You don't want to be cutting anything off too much. And up here, you can kind of see that, you can't see that in the camera, but you can have a look-see here on the top of where your presser foot is, that everything is kind of coming at an angle. And you're going to get started here, and then you'll level off to bring it up to match these edges with your knife. Okay, so when you come back to your starting point, you're going to want to make sure that you stitch across this beginning area probably at least about a 1/2 inch. So remember, you came in here at an angle, so you want to make sure that you actually sew across that. And then once you get your needles in here, you know that you've got an overlapping of your stitches. What you'll do is you'll stop, put the needle down, and you'll pull this fabric away, and then you will stitch off. Okay, so now that we've got the neckband on, let's actually work with the armhole bands. And the armhole bands, all we're going to need to do is we're going to fold these with wrong sides together lengthwise, and we'll match the cut edges and the notches. And that's all we need to do. You could just press them, finger press them. I'm going to go ahead and put pins in. And we have some notches here to take into account. Now I'm just going to do one of these. The other will be exactly the same. So we have some notches here. We have a castle notch and then 2 triangle notches. So the castle notch here matches to the back. This triangle notch here in the middle matches to the shoulder. The other triangle match notches to the front. So let's go ahead and do that. And then these 2 actual cut edges match to the side seam. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Let's lay the garment out. And here is the front. The shoulder seam, we want to make sure this actually gets folded to the back, the same as what it was for the neckband. And then, of course, the castle notch for the back. So here we go. I'm going to match, I like to first match the shoulder. And actually, I gotta change over my pins. Really quick, do this really quickly. So I'm matching my shoulder notch, and then the shoulder notch to the armhole band. And then I will match the notches. If I want to grab another pin, and then I'll match the end to the edge of the garment. And again, you're going to be stretching the binding to fit the garment. Matching the castle notch on the neck, on the armhole band to the castle notch on the armhole. And then, of course, the end to the garment back at the side seam. Okay, and then we're going to run this through the overlock, get this all stitched together. Now, one note, while in the overlock, I guided you through the neckband a little bit. So remember to push the end all the way up to the needle when you start, but don't cut the extra threads off at either end. We'll take care of those when we do the side seam. All right, so let's go ahead and sew this on. Okay, so the armhole bindings are on. All we need to do is match up the front and the back face sides together, and then we're going to actually match up the side seams, starting here at the top. And you want to make sure that the seam allowance of the binding is actually folded down toward the garment. And we're going to try our best to match those seams in there. So I'm just going to pin that together just to hold it together. And then there are a couple of notches here to match. I'll match this notch. This fabric has a mind of its own, so as do most knits. So I'm going to grab these notches and I'll match it. And these pins are probably not going the right way, so I'll just have to readjust them. So I'll just do this one side seam, and you will be able to do the other one. So I'm matching this other notch. And then I'm going to match the hem notches. And I believe we have an inch hem allowance on the bottom. Okay, so this is actually not the right side. I actually, because these seams here are folding down, I'm actually going to start at the top. Now I usually start at the bottom and go up, but this will just make it a little bit easier, and hopefully I can catch that seam, so we match that seam in there. Okay, so that means I'm going to actually just flip this over, and I'm going to readjust. See, on this side I didn't have that seam folded down, so I'm just going to make sure that's folded down. And for this part right here, just to keep those together, match those together, and I'm going to put a pin here this way because I know those are pretty close. I can see in there, just peek in there like that, see if you're close. That looks pretty good. And so sewing from here will actually automatically make those seams fold down. So I just got to adjust these pins in the direction that I'm sewing. And remember, if you haven't watched my other videos, once you're matching and you're pinning, if you pin far away enough, if you know the width of your presser foot, it's about an inch, you won't actually have to remove the pins as you sew. Just make sure that you're not getting any little pleats there. And then my last one here. So now I'm going to overlock this straight down, and when we do that, it'll automatically cut these threads off. Okay, so we just finished the side seam, but don't cut this extra thread off at the beginning. Leave it like this, and we will actually take care of that while we're in the regular sewing machine, because the next step is actually to do the hem, and after that we will actually do some finishing steps that will make your tank dress really nice. Okay, so we have the side seams done. Again, as I mentioned before, don't cut these extra threads off. We're going to take care of those in the regular sewing machine after we finish the hem. And that's actually the next thing we have to do. So let's turn the garment face side out. And make sure your hem area is nice and flat. And at this point, because we have, it's marked on the pattern, a 1-inch hem. See how I'm making this nice and flat here in this area? I know knits have a mind of their own. They like to curl up. Try to get it as nice and flat as you can. Try not to stretch it. We have 1 inch. Now, I know you're going to want to just press up the inch and stitch it, but because you have a knit, it might have some synthetic in it that I mentioned before, polyester, nylon, elastane, or spandex. When you press it, you might be melting those fibers. And if you press it and you get shine on the outside, that shine is not going to go away because you've actually essentially melted the fiber and melted that shine into it. So what I like to do is I'm actually going to turn this around because I'm right-handed. Turn this around, and I'm going to use some chalk and my ruler, and I'm just going to, or if you can also use an erasable pen or marker, mark up 1 inch, and just mark that all the way from the edge all the way around. Now if you're more advanced, you don't even need to pin this up, but I'll go ahead and pin it up after I overlock it. Also, if you have a cover stitch machine, you can use that, and you don't even need to overlock the edge. So you turn it up the 1 inch, and then did I say overlock? I meant a cover stitch machine. So you can cover stitch this up. Of course, you're cover stitching on the face side of the fabric. So now that I've got that marked, I'm going to go ahead and overlock this to get it ready for zigzagging the hem up. Now, of course, you could also use a double needle. If you use a double needle, I would suggest that you use a bulky nylon or woolly nylon thread in the bobbin, and that will give it a little bit more stretch. Because you definitely need this to stretch if you're walking around. So that's why I use a zigzag. And I'm going to use for the full size, you should be using like a 4mm wide and 4mm long. So the millimeters just are the numbers on your machine. So that sounds like really big, but of course you can use any size you want. So mine will actually look a little bit smaller because I'm working on a half-size pattern. So, and you also don't really need to overlock the edge of this because it's not really going to fray. And of course it will be kind of caught in the zigzagging or the cover stitch. But I'm just going to go ahead and do that. If you do choose to overlock this, we had a pretty good tension for the seams, so I would probably loosen up the tension on the upper and lower loopers on your overlock if you want to do that on the edge. The reason I'm overlocking now after I marked my 1 inch is because, well, some of you are beginners and you accidentally cut anything off of here and then you turn it up 1 inch, you're going to have a shorter dress than you had anticipated. So mark your hem first, then overlock, and then press up or pin up, and then stitch down. So that's what I'm going to do right now. Okay, so we've got the overlocking done, and I'm just going to turn this inside out. It's going to be easier to actually see this. So I'm actually going to just start on one of the side seams here, look at the outside, and I'm going to fold it up here on my marking line. Now, if you are more advanced, you don't really need to pin this. You can just fold it up as you go. But I'm just going to go ahead and pin this in place so you can see this. So the pins are going on the inside as I sew. That's why I turned it inside out. So I'm just going to pin this all the way around, folding up on my marks. And the marks actually just assure that you're actually getting that straight hem, or that accurate hem, rather. And you may need to stretch just slightly as you sew. You can see in some parts of it there's extra. In a lot of cases, in a lot of dresses, your hem will be actually a little bit larger than the area you're folding into. But the nice thing about a knit is that you can just slightly stretch it and it will feed through. And then as this is worn, it'll actually just kind of come back and recover on itself. That is really nice about knits. So continue to go around here. And when I do the zigzag, which I'm going to instead of the cover stitch, I'm going to do a zigzag because I also want to do some finishing touches on this, and I'm going to do those all in the machine. And as I get this pinned, I'll explain those in just a minute. Okay, so I'm all pinned up around here, so I'm actually going to use a zigzag. And when I do the zigzag, one of my stitches is going to just come right here on this edge of the hem right here. So the needle will go down here, and then it will come up here, and then go back toward this side. Now the other things that I'm going to do in the machine, I'm not going to come back here after I finish the hem. We're going to stay in the machine, and we're going to take care of these extra threads here, and we're going to make it a little bit nicer. I'm going to find the back. So I've got my center back here. So these threads, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold these back onto the seam allowance here, and they're going toward the back. And I'm just going to actually do a little tack stitch here, 1 or 2 stitches back and forth, not a whole lot, just to hold this down, and then I will cut this off. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this seam allowance over, and then over here on the face side, I'm just going to do a tack here to hold that seam allowance down toward the back, and I'll do it on the other side. And then while I'm also in there, I'm actually going to talk to you about your bands some top stitching that you could do, and I will go ahead and do that and reset via zigzag stitch, or if you have a cover stitch machine. Now on the neckband, you would want to fold this toward the body and then just do a top stitch right along this edge, and that will keep the seam allowance from actually pulling out and irritating you. And you can also do that also with the armhole. And I'll go ahead and do all of that in the machine. Again, the first thing I'm going to do is this hem. I'm going to get this hem taken care of. Okay, so now finishing the underarm area, and I'm talking about these extra threads. So I'm just going to actually fold this onto the seam, and then I'm actually just going to stitch it down to the seam with just a couple of stitches. It doesn't have to be a lot. In fact, you don't want it to be a lot. So I'm just going to get it in here, maybe get my needle to go down in the spot there. It's caught it. So now I'm just going to get ready to backstitch, go a little bit, and then backstitch. That's all I needed to do. Pull this out of here, and then I'm going to actually now, you see it's actually held to that seam allowance, so it's not going to unravel. Sometimes when you cut these overlock stitches up here, they unravel and then your seam comes undone. So this is a quick way to alleviate that, or to head that off. Look at this other thread out of the way. Now, one other thing you can do is that make sure that you have this all going toward the back, and I've actually made sure that I was looking at the center back there, is take this seam, open up this armhole a little bit, and you're going to fold this seam toward the back right on top of that other binding. And then what we'll do, I'm just going to finger press this kind of hard a little bit, and then I'm going to put this into the machine with that down. You could do it on this side as well, but I'm going to do it on the top side, and I'm just going to get this in here, get this under that foot. Now, depending on the style of your machine, you may have a little difficulty with this. I'm going to get my needle to go down, and then I'll put the foot down. And right here, this little bump is where you're going to have a hard time, and we don't even need to sew on that. I just want to hold that seam in. So let me see and make sure that my fingers are out of the way, right? And that everything is folded the right way. And I'm just going to sew, and I'm going to get ready to backstitch. See if it will. I don't think is it going to take it? So you may run into this. If you do, that's going to be the tough part. So that's a teachable moment. If that happens to you, it doesn't want to go. And the reason it doesn't want to go is because, I'm going to take this foot off, is because I don't have a lot of pull here with these feed dogs, because all the feed dogs are back here. So a way to fix that, let me put this foot back on, is I'm actually going to get back in here, feed this the opposite way. So I'm turning this around, and it's still going the same way that I need it, and I'm going to have to clip this out. Okay, now I've got most of the fabric going toward the back where those feed dogs are. Put this down, and I'm going to get that needle down. Sorry, my hand's in the way. All my buttons are on the front of my machine. So now I should be able to sew at least forward, because all the fabric is back here where all the feed dogs are. So I'm actually going to sew, see if it will take it. Look at that, it takes it. I don't know if I'm going to be able to backstitch or not. Not a whole lot. Let's see what happens if I have the needle down, pull this back around, and then stitch. Not really going to go. Again, I stuck my finger under there. It's a good thing I didn't sew it. So I like to keep these things in the video when I'm having difficulty with some of these things, because you can see that even I, as a professional, have difficulty and I have to do workarounds. But if you can actually get your machine to do this little bit of stitching to hold this seam back, then it will, one, make your garment look a lot nicer. Of course, this doesn't look nice right now, but it will actually keep that seam away from your body and keep it from irritating you. And I'm just going to clean this up a little bit more. And I'm actually going to go ahead and do that to the other side as well. Okay, so technically your tank dress is done. Now, one thing I used, just to let you know, I used the white thread so that you could see everything. So you may want to use either a nicer contrasting thread or actually a thread that blends in with your fabric. So you may go ahead and press this, but remember, if you do press it, use a press cloth, especially if you have synthetics in here. You don't want to melt the fabric. Even if you put the iron on and you don't realize how hot the iron is on it, it will melt that and it will cause shine, and then you'll have a nice shine pattern in the shape of your iron, and you don't want to have that happen. Now, even though that you're actually technically done, I'm going to take one more step before I close out the video. And remember, I mentioned decorative stitching around here, the neckline and the armhole. You may have seen cover stitching, which is 2 needles and then a covering stitch underneath on athletic apparel. I'm actually just going to use a smaller zigzag, and what that's going to do is it's going to keep these seams toward the garment and away from your body. So I'm going to go ahead and do that really quick. I'm going to speed that section up, and then I'll come back here and close out the video. Okay, so now I have done the stitching around the neckline and the armholes, and I did a smaller zigzag here around the neckline, and then I actually did it a little bit wider around the armhole. There was no reason for that. I just decided to see what it would look like. Sometimes when you do a smaller one like this, it stretches the area out a little bit more, so that's why I just widened this up a little bit. And actually that finishes up the tank top. I do have one small confession to make, is that when I sized this down for the half size, I actually did not resize the width of the binding. And then after having a look at this binding, I actually also have changed the width of the binding you have. So I know it looks a little bit like I've got extra here, and that's because it's actually a little bit too wide. So this should be much less wide, like this, and then it would lay a little bit flatter. And I've actually adjusted the pattern that you have to finish at a 1/2 inch finished width. So just understand that. So that's my only confession on this one. If you've gotten this done, this is a great beginner pattern and project to do. And again, I did the full length. This is a half size pattern. Of course, you have the full size pattern. So there's your tank dress. Congratulations, and wear it with pride.